On a narrow barrier island in Palm Beach, there's a palace that almost didn't make it into the modern era. Not because storms destroyed it, not because time wore it down, but because the math stopped working. Maintenance bills, security costs, staff requirements, the kind of numbers that can quietly kill even the most beautiful place on Earth. The estate is Mar-a-Lago, sea to lake, and it's one of those buildings that feels less like a house and more like a statement someone carved into the coastline. Built in the 1920s by a woman who didn't just have money, she had vision, control, and a belief that if you built something grand enough, history would protect it. Her name was Marjorie Merriweather Post, and for a time she was one of the wealthiest women in America. She filled her estate with antiques, rare tiles, and rooms designed to impress presidents and princes. She didn't build a winter cottage, she built a stage, made for power, glamour, diplomacy, and social gravity. But after her death, that same grandeur turned into a liability. The government wanted it, then didn't. Buyers toured it, then walked away. Permits were filed, wrecking crews were nearly scheduled, and for a brief moment, the most famous mansion on the island was just months away from becoming rubble. So how does a palace built to last forever come that close to disappearing? The answer starts long before Post, long before architects, and long before the island even had the name that made it famous.
Before Palm Beach became a symbol of American wealth, it was a harsh strip of land with more mosquitoes than comfort, more scrub than elegance. And the transformation didn't begin with a mansion. It began with chance and a coastline that turns accidents into destiny. In the late 1800s, this part of Florida was still being discovered by northern visitors who wanted warmth, sunshine, and distance from winter. The ocean was beautiful, yes, but it was also dangerous. Ships wrecked, supplies arrived late, settlers survived by stubbornness, fishing, and whatever the environment allowed. Then the region found its magnet, a vision of luxury that could pull rich families down the coast like a tide. That vision belonged to Henry Flagler, a man who helped build Standard Oil alongside John D. Rockefeller, then turned his attention to Florida like it was a blank map. Flagler didn't just build hotels, he built a system, rail lines, service towns, staff housing, and the kind of infrastructure that makes exclusive possible. He understood something simple. Wealthy guests don't want adventure. They want comfort that feels effortless. When the luxury resorts arrived, a seasonal rhythm formed. The season became a social universe. The richest families on Earth didn't just visit, they competed. They built estates that were less about living and more about proving. And by the early 21st, Palm Beach was ready for a new kind of project, not just another mansion, but a symbol so large it could dominate the island's imagination. That's when Marjorie Post enters the story, not as a tourist, but as a builder. Marjorie Post's rise didn't start in Florida. It started with inheritance, sudden, heavy, and complicated. Her father built a fortune through the company that would become General Foods, selling products that entered millions of kitchens. When he died, Marjorie didn't inherit nice money. She inherited an empire at a time when women were still expected to stay out of boardrooms. But she wasn't raised to be passive. She was trained early. She learned how money moves, how decisions ripple, how reputations are manufactured. And she understood that wealth without visibility is fragile. You have to shape the story. She partnered personally and professionally with E.F. Hutton & Co. legend E.F. Hutton, and their business moves were bold. They expanded, they acquired, they scaled, and she became something rare in that era, a woman who could host a gala at night and steer a corporate strategy by morning. One purchase captured her instincts perfectly, Clarence Birdseye's freezing innovation. Most people saw frozen food as a gimmick. Post saw the future, an everyday revolution that would change how families lived. That pattern, spot the long-term value before the crowd, shows up again and again in her life. By the time she looked south toward Florida, she wasn't searching for a vacation home. She was looking for a platform, a place where her power could be seen, where influence could gather, where history might eventually attach itself to her name. Palm Beach offered that stage. She just needed the right piece of land, and it had to be special enough to justify building something no one could ignore. Finding land in Palm Beach in the 1920s wasn't like shopping for property today. The most desirable locations were already claimed, and the island didn't have endless space to give. Post needed size, she needed ocean access, she needed prestige, and she needed something that most properties couldn't offer: a footprint that would allow a building to feel like a world of its own. Guest wings, service wings, courtyards, staff quarters, gardens, and entertaining rooms that wouldn't feel cramped with 100 people inside. Then she found it, a stretch of acreage that ran from the Atlantic Ocean across the island to the Lake Worth Lagoon, sea to lake. That geography wasn't just beautiful, it was symbolic. It meant the estate could literally contain two worlds: sunrise on one side, sunset on the other, open ocean and quiet water, public glamour and private calm. Now she needed a design that could match the land's drama. She didn't hire ordinary designers. She assembled a team the way a producer assembles a film. The structure would be handled by Marion Sims Wyeth, who knew Palm Beach architecture. But for the interior, where the real psychological impact would happen, she wanted someone who understood spectacle, not just design. That's where Joseph Urban enters, a theatrical designer who knew how to make rooms feel like scenes, not decorated spaces, experiences. Rooms that tell your guests what to feel before you even speak. Post's go wasn't subtle. She wanted a house that would make even wealthy visitors pause, a house that would change conversations, a house built like a statement: I am here and I am permanent. But permanent is expensive, and the construction that followed was a logistical event as much as an architectural one. Mar-a-Lago wasn't built the way most mansions were built. It was built like a campaign. Post didn't just say, "Make it beautiful." She demanded materials with history, stone that looked aged, tiles that carried centuries, details that made a brand new palace feel like it had always belonged on the island. Shipments arrived from overseas. Craftsmen shaped stone and plaster on site. Antique tiles were collected in huge numbers, then carefully placed so the floors didn't feel like patchwork, but like deliberate art. And then there was the scale. The staff requirements alone tell you what kind of building this was. A house so large it couldn't operate like a home. It needed teams, cooks, groundskeepers, cleaners, service staff, because an estate isn't just walls and roofs, it's systems, it's maintenance, it's constant labor hidden behind elegance. Mar-a-Lago rose as Palm Beach was in its most intense era of glamour building. This was the age of visible wealth, where society wasn't just lived, it was performed. If your house wasn't impressive, you were invisible. Post understood that. She wasn't building a shelter, she was building influence you could walk through. Long corridors, massive entertaining spaces, a tower that watched the island, courtyards designed for entrances that felt like arrivals. By the time the estate opened, it wasn't just another Palm Beach home, it was a centerpiece, an anchor for a social season that already operated like a royal court. And for Post, the palace finally had its purpose, not to sit quietly, but to host. When Mar-a-Lago became active, it wasn't just a house with parties. It became a machine that produced social gravity. Post hosted with strategy. Guest lists were not random. Seating charts mattered. Who met whom mattered. And the house itself was built to support that choreography. Formal rooms for state-level dinners, smaller rooms for private conversations, guest accommodations to keep important people close for days, not hours. This wasn't simply entertainment, it was influence. The most powerful thing about hosting isn't the food, it's access. If someone can't get into your home, they can't get into your world. And Post turned Mar-a-Lago into a kind of winter capital, where business, politics, culture, and elite society overlapped in the same rooms. But her story isn't only glamour. She carried a strong belief that wealth came with responsibility. Her estate hosted charity events. She supported causes with real money, not just signatures and speeches. She used the spectacle to raise funds and sometimes to put different worlds in the same space on purpose. That dual identity, luxury and duty, was central to Post. She didn't want to be remembered only as a rich woman with a palace. She wanted to be remembered as someone who built a cultural landmark, then used it. Yet her life didn't stay anchored in Palm Beach. Another chapter pulled her far away, from sunlit terraces to the icy edge of global politics.
One of the strangest twists in Marjorie Post's life is that the woman who built a Florida palace ended up serving as an American diplomatic hostess in the heart of the Soviet Union. She married Joseph E. Davies, and when he was appointed ambassador, Post entered a world where every word could be overheard and every dinner could carry political weight. But diplomacy, at its core, is still human. People eat. People talk, people watch each other, and Post was uniquely skilled at turning a meal into a bridge. She hosted in a setting where suspicion was normal. She performed American hospitality as a subtle argument, stability, abundance, confidence, not through speeches, through detail. And while she was there, she made another move that shaped her legacy, collecting Russian imperial art. Not as trophies, but as preservation. Many treasures of the old regime were being sold off. Post bought pieces that might have been scattered, lost, or destroyed, and later housed them in collections that still exist today. It's a remarkable contrast. The same woman who built Mar-a-Lago's fantasy world interiors was also collecting artifacts from a collapsing world system. She understood symbolism. She understood permanence. She understood that what you save becomes part of your name. But while she collected, time kept moving. Seasons changed. Palm Beach changed. And the biggest problem of Mar-a-Lago wasn't design or reputation or even history. It was the cost of keeping a palace alive. Large estates have a hidden reality. The house doesn't end when construction ends. The bills never stop. The staff never stops. The repairs never stop. Salt air, humidity, storms, Florida turns maintenance into a full-time war. Post could afford it. She had an empire, and she had the discipline to manage complicated operations. But even for her, the question of the estate's future wasn't simple. As she aged, the world around Mar-a-Lago began to shift. The era of private palaces as normal status symbols was fading. New wealth didn't always want old problems. Families grew less interested in maintaining multi-wing estates that needed dozens of employees just to function. And Post faced a fact that most mansion builders avoid thinking about until it's too late. After you're gone, who pays for the dream? She had daughters, but she understood that inheriting Mar-a-Lago was not just inheriting beauty. It was inheriting responsibility, and an expensive one. So she considered a solution that sounded logical. Transfer the estate to the federal government, turning it into a kind of winter retreat for presidents, something like a southern counterpart to other official residences. It fit the symbolism. It preserved the building.
It gave the house an ongoing purpose. On paper, it looked like the perfect way to make her palace permanent. In reality, it became the beginning of Mar-a-Lago's most fragile era.
When the government inherited Mar-a-Lago, the problems showed up fast. The trust money attached to the gift wasn't enough, not close. The maintenance costs for a property like this are not small increases year to year. They're structural. You need security, you need constant repairs, you need staff, you need upgrades to meet modern requirements. And then there was a practical issue. Presidents didn't actually need it. Richard Nixon had his own Florida retreat. Jimmy Carter's administration looked at the numbers and saw the burden. The estate wasn't designed to be efficient. It was designed to be extraordinary. In a private world, extraordinary is the point. In a public budget, extraordinary is a problem. The government explored options, evaluated requirements, and wrestled with the question, is preserving this worth what it costs taxpayers every year? Eventually, they made the decision that shocked people who assumed historic places are automatically protected. They returned it. The government's ownership ended. The palace went back to the Post Foundation. And suddenly, the estate was in the most dangerous position a landmark can be in. Too valuable to ignore, too expensive to keep, and too complex to sell. That's when the almost demolition chapter becomes real, not as drama, but as paperwork.
Once Mar-a-Lago returned to the Post Foundation, it entered a market that didn't know what to do with it. Who buys a palace that costs millions a year to maintain? It's not enough to be rich. You have to be rich and willing to spend enormous money on upkeep forever. Potential buyers toured. They admired. They asked questions. Then they walked away. And while the estate waited, time did what time always does. It started eating the details. Gardens become wild. Paint ages. Systems break. A building designed to host becomes quiet, and quiet is dangerous for old places. The foundation faced a brutal choice: keep bleeding money or convert the land into something that pays. And the land itself was a fortune, 17 acres in one of the most exclusive locations in America. The idea of demolition wasn't madness, it was economics. Permits moved, plans formed. The estate came frighteningly close to being broken apart and replaced by smaller lots, modern development, and a story that ended with, "It used to be here." This is the moment where a palace's survival depends on one thing: someone showing up who sees value where everyone else sees cost. And that's where Donald Trump enters the story, not as the end of Post's legacy, but as the reason Mar-a-Lago didn't vanish. Trump's interest in Mar-a-Lago wasn't random. The property had something you could no longer replicate: scale, location, and a footprint that zoning rules and modern development patterns would never allow again. But he also understood leverage. The foundation wanted a buyer. Trump wanted a bargain. And while accounts differ on exact numbers, the heart of the story is consistent. Mar-a-Lago was priced for what it meant, but the market treated it as a liability. Trump approached the deal creatively. He didn't just negotiate the estate. He looked at surrounding land, sight lines, and pressure points. He recognized that ocean views weren't just a perk. They were part of the estate's identity and value. The final deal happened, and then the restoration began. Because buying a palace is only step one. The real cost comes after: roofs, systems, grounds, staff, preservation requirements, and the endless fight against Florida weather. Whatever you think of the buyer, the practical result was undeniable. Mar-a-Lago was active again, maintained again. The lights were on, the staff returned, the place stopped sliding toward abandonment. But keeping it as a private home still carried the same old problem: the operating costs. So the next transformation wasn't architectural, it was business. Mar-a-Lago didn't survive by staying a home. It survived by becoming a product.
In the 1990s, the estate faced the same logic that defeated the government and scared away buyers: huge fixed costs. A private residence doesn't generate revenue, but a club does. After negotiations with local authorities, Mar-a-Lago was converted into a private membership club. That wasn't just a rebrand, it was a survival strategy. Membership fees, events, dining, bookings, suddenly the costs had a counterweight. In a way, this echoed Post's original intention. She didn't build Mar-a-Lago to be quiet, she built it to host. The club model simply industrialized that function. But the identity shifted. Under Post, entertaining was a social craft and a philanthropic tool. Under club operations, entertaining became a business engine. The palace became a venue, a status symbol you could buy access to. And it worked. It turned a financial problem into a revenue stream. It made the property sustainable. It ensured repairs could keep happening year after year. But sustainability always comes with trade-offs. A historic estate is not a blank canvas. Preservation rules matter. Local politics matter. Public attention matters. And as Mar-a-Lago's visibility grew, so did the debate. Was the place being protected or transformed into something its creator never intended? That tension between preservation and reinvention is exactly why this estate became more than architecture. It became a mirror. Mar-a-Lago's story isn't just about a building, it's about how America treats power. Post built it as a personal statement during an age that celebrated visible wealth. It became a social hub. Then it became a diplomatic backdrop. Then it became a government experiment. Then it became a near ruin. Then it became a private club. Each era used the same rooms differently, and each era rewrote what the estate meant. That's why Mar-a-Lago attracts legend. People look at a place this grand and assume it must have one fixed identity, one true purpose. But grand buildings rarely stay pure. They get repurposed by whoever has the money, the authority, or the will to keep them alive. In that sense, Mar-a-Lago is almost like a ship that survives by changing owners. The structure is the same, but the mission changes. What makes this story tragic isn't just the risk of demolition. It's that Post built the palace believing she could control its future. She believed she could design permanence. But permanence doesn't come from stone. It comes from systems, funding, governance, use, and relevance. When Mar-a-Lago lost relevance, it almost died. When it regained relevance through reinvention, it survived. And that's the uncomfortable truth behind many historic estates. Survival often requires becoming something different. Now let's go back to the person at the center of the title, the heiress herself. Post's life was larger than Mar-a-Lago. She wasn't famous only for having money. She was famous for what she built with it: business empires, philanthropy, collections, institutions. Her giving wasn't accidental. She funded hospitals, she supported major charities, she invested in music, education, and public life. She didn't treat charity as an accessory, she treated it like responsibility. That's why Mar-a-Lago was never just a private playground. It was a place she used to raise money, host major causes, and bring powerful people into the same room. So the tragedy of Mar-a-Lago isn't only economic, it's emotional. Because the estate was designed as her legacy, something that would outlast her and keep serving a purpose. But after her death, it became a problem everyone tried to solve and no one wanted to inherit. The government rejected it. Buyers avoided it. The foundation couldn't carry it forever. For a woman who built in the language of permanence, that rejection is the sharpest irony of all. And the fact that the estate survived, under a completely different identity, adds a final twist. It didn't vanish, but it also didn't stay hers. If you strip away politics and headlines, Mar-a-Lago's survival comes down to one brutal principle. History is expensive.
We like the idea that iconic places are protected by love, admiration, and cultural value, but most landmarks are protected by budgets, revenue, and sustained attention. When the attention disappears, the building becomes vulnerable. That's why the demolition moment matters so much. It proves that even a palace with imported stone and antique tiles can end in a dumpster if nobody can justify the cost. And it shows why saving a place often means changing it. Post tried to save it by gifting it. That failed. The foundation tried to save it by selling it. That stalled. The club model saved it by monetizing it. In the modern world, the best way to preserve something is often to make it pay its own bills, because once it pays bills, it earns protection. That's not poetic, it's not romantic, but it's real. And that reality is the key lesson of Mar-a-Lago, not just how wealth builds monuments, but how economics decides what survives.
So what does Mar-a-Lago represent now? To some, it's a symbol of luxury. To others, a symbol of power. To many, it's a headline generator. But if you zoom out, it's something simpler and more revealing. It's proof that America's most iconic places don't stay frozen in time. They evolve. They get reinterpreted. They become stages for new eras. Mar-a-Lago began as one woman's dream of cultural permanence. Then it became a question the government couldn't answer. Then it became a property market failure. Then it became a private business strategy. And through all of that, the building remained, a constant shape holding different meanings like layers. That's why it feels almost alive in public imagination, not because of mystery in the walls, but because the story keeps changing in front of people. We tend to think the real story of a building is its origin, but sometimes the real story is its survival, the decisions, compromises, and reinventions that keep it standing. And in that survival story, Mar-a-Lago tells you something about the country that built it. Glamour, ambition, reinvention, and the cold logic that decides what gets remembered. If Mar-a-Lago had been demolished, Marjorie Post would have been reduced to a footnote, heiress who built a mansion that didn't last. But because it survived, her story keeps resurfacing, even when the focus shifts away from her. And that's why the phrase, America's greatest heiress, matters. Not as hype, but as a question. What does great mean? Post didn't simply inherit, she expanded. She operated, she collected, she gave, she hosted. She used wealth like a tool, not only to build comfort, but to build institutions and cultural memory. Mar-a-Lago was one part of that, the most visible part, the most dramatic part, the part that turned her lifestyle into architecture. But the deeper legacy sits behind the palace, her role in shaping business, philanthropy, and the way private wealth can leave public marks. In the end, her palace didn't stay hers, but the fact that we still talk about it, still trace its origin back to her, means she achieved at least one thing she wanted. She built something history couldn't ignore. Mar-a-Lago's story begins with a dream of permanence and ends with a lesson about survival. A palace on a barrier island sounds immortal, but it nearly vanished because beauty doesn't protect a building. Money protects a building, purpose protects a building, and attention protects a building. Marjorie Post built Mar-a-Lago to host the world. After she died, the world couldn't decide what to do with it. The government tried and failed, buyers hesitated, demolition became practical. And then reinvention saved it, not as a family home, not as a presidential retreat, but as a machine that could fund its own existence. That's the haunting truth behind many American landmarks. If they can't pay their way, they become history, literally flattened. Mar-a-Lago refused to disappear. Not because it was destined, not because it was protected by romance, but because at the last moment, someone found a way to make the dream financially survivable.
And maybe that's the most American ending possible. A palace built by an heiress, nearly destroyed by economics, and saved by reinvention. Still standing, still changing, still pulling attention like gravity.